Chad, Beast Cooper, a black belt instructor whose arrogance was as sharp as his kicks at Warrior's Den Fitness Center, spotted 10-year-old Violet Schmidt quietly tucked away in a corner. He immediately saw her as the ideal target for his next humiliating demonstration. A cruel joke designed to impress his students. Yet what began as a calculated ploy was about to unleash the most shocking moment the gym had ever witnessed. It's a timeless truth that the most explosive surprises often come in the smallest packages, and Chad was about to learn a brutal lesson. Never underestimate anyone based on their size, age, or unassuming quietness. In just 3 minutes, this seemingly ordinary little girl would utterly demolish his conceit, expose his deeply ingrained prejudices, and impart a lesson in respect that would forever alter the entire community. Overhead, fluorescent lights hummed as the constant squeak of sneakers on polished floors resonated throughout Warrior's Den. Dr. Susan Schmidt pushed through the double-glass doors, her hospital scrubs still creased from a grueling 12-hour shift at Sunset Hills Memorial. Her 10-year-old daughter, Violet, trailed silently behind, clutching a well-worn paperback book tightly against her chest. The familiar scent of rubber mats and disinfectant filled Susan's nostrils as she scanned the bustling gym, searching for an unoccupied bench. Just 30 minutes, sweetheart, Susan whispered to Violet, her hand gently squeezing her daughter's small shoulder. Mommy needs a quick word with Coach Murphy about the youth program registration. Violet nodded, her large brown eyes quietly taking in the controlled chaos surrounding them. Teenagers and adults moved purposefully between various wait stations, while on the far side of the room, younger children in colorful uniforms practiced a flurry of kicks and punches. The rhythmic thudding of heavy bags provided a steady percussion beneath the instructor's sharp, commanding voice. Susan led Violet to a row of plastic chairs positioned along the wall, away from the main training area. Stay here and read your book. I'll be right back. As Susan headed towards the front desk, Violet settled into her chair and opened her book, though her gaze repeatedly drifted toward the martial arts class in session. A tall, muscular man, impeccably clad in a pristine white uniform and a black belt, was demonstrating a series of powerful kicks to a group of teenage students. His movements were precise and formidable, yet something in his booming tone made Violet's stomach clench with an unsettling unease. "Higher, Scott," the instructor barked at a lanky 16-year-old with perfectly styled blonde hair. "That's it, Brandon. Show these kids how it's done." Brandon Scott beamed under the praise, executing another kick with exaggerated flair. His wealthy mother, Stephanie, watched proudly from the observation area, occasionally casting a glance at her diamond-encrusted watch. "Now watch what happens when technique meets real power," the instructor continued, his voice effortlessly carrying across the entire gym. Chad Beast Cooper lived for these exact moments of public demonstration, when every eye in the room was fixed on his apparent superior skills and commanding presence. At 28, he had meticulously crafted his reputation on a foundation of intimidation and flashy, attention-grabbing techniques that consistently impressed parents while simultaneously cowering his students. From her quiet corner, Violet observed him, noting the subtle yet distinct ways Chad treated different students. When Ryan Kelly, an 11-year-old boy whose gear looked conspicuously second-hand, attempted the same kick Chad had just demonstrated, the instructor's earlier encouragement abruptly curdled into sharp criticism. "Kelly, what was that supposed to be?" Chad's voice dripped with undisguised disdain. My grandmother could kick higher than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. A few students snickered nervously, while Ryan's face flushed a deep, mortified red. His mother, Nancy Kelly, shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her work uniform still displaying the name tag from her evening job at the local diner. She worked 2 jobs just to afford Ryan's classes, clinging to the hope that martial arts would help her shy son build some much-needed confidence. "Try again," Chad commanded, crossing his arms as Ryan tentatively attempted another kick. "Put some effort into it this time." Violet's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on her book as she watched the humiliating scene unfold. She had witnessed similar interactions during their previous visits to the gym, always feeling a profound sense of helplessness as Chad systematically dismantled the confidence of certain students while deliberately elevating others. There was a clear, disturbing pattern to his favoritism, a pattern so obvious even a 10-year-old could easily recognize it. Across the room, Arthur Art. Wallace quietly, methodically mopped the floors near the equipment storage area. At 72, the elderly janitor moved with the surprising, almost fluid grace, his weathered hands steady and efficient as he worked. Few people ever paid much attention to Art, a fact that suited him perfectly. He had learned long ago that the most effective way to truly understand people was to observe them when they believed no one was watching. Art's keen, discerning eyes had been tracking Chad's behavior for months, meticulously noting the instructor's troubling tendency to humiliate students who couldn't afford the premium training packages or whose parents lacked significant influence within the community. The old man had seen enough bullies in his lifetime to instantly recognize Chad's type. "Bella, your friends reading again?" Owen Clark whispered to Bella Adams, subtly nodding towards Violet's corner. Owen, 13, was undeniably talented, but Chad's harsh criticisms constantly discouraged him. His natural ability seemed to threaten Chad's favored students, making Owen a frequent target of the instructor's disdain. Bella Adams turned to look at Violet and offered a small, gentle smile. At 12, Bella possessed the kind of quiet confidence that stemmed from a supportive family environment and innate athletic ability. Her father, Thomas Adams, worked in construction, but never once missed an opportunity to actively encourage his daughter's diverse interests. "She always brings books," Bella replied quietly, her voice barely a murmur. "My dad says some people find strength in different places." Chad's surprisingly sharp hearing caught the whispered conversation. His piercing ice-blue eyes swept across the vast room, finally landing with chilling precision on Violet's small, hunched figure, absorbed in her book. A slow, predatory smile began to spread across his face as a new idea, a particularly cruel one, began to form in his mind. He had been actively looking for a new target, a way to truly demonstrate the vital importance of proper training and unwavering discipline to his students, and the quiet little girl in the corner presented the perfect, opportune target. "Class, gather around," Chad announced, his voice suddenly adopting the theatrical tone he reserved for his most memorable, impactful lessons. "Today we're going to learn about the profound difference between real, dedicated martial arts training and mere wishful thinking." The students, quickly, formed a loose circle in the center of the mat area, their expressions a mix of eager curiosity and growing apprehension. Brandon Scott strategically positioned himself directly in front of Chad, visibly eager to be chosen for whatever demonstration was about to unfold. Chad's gaze, however, fixed intently on Violet, who remained entirely absorbed in her book, blissfully unaware that she had suddenly become the focal point of his attention. "You see," he began, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "anyone can pretend to know martial arts. They watch movies. They read books. Maybe they even take a few classes here and there. But when it comes to facing real skill, real power, the truth always comes out." Several parents in the observation area began paying closer attention, sensing that Chad was meticulously building toward one of his infamous, often humiliating demonstrations. Detective Joe Edwards, a regular at the gym who typically worked out after his shifts, frowned visibly as he recognized the familiar, unsettling pattern of Chad's behavior. "The martial arts aren't a game," Chad continued, beginning to slowly pace around the perimeter of the student circle. "They require absolute dedication, unwavering discipline, and natural ability. Some people genuinely have what it takes, and others—" He paused dramatically, letting his gaze sweep deliberately across the room again. "Others are just fooling themselves." Violet finally looked up from her book, sensing the distinct shift in the room's energy. Her eyes met Chad's cold blue gaze, and her heart immediately began to race. Something in his predatory expression chillingly reminded her of the bullies at school, the ones who relentlessly picked on smaller kids simply because they knew they could get away with it. "What's your name?" "Little girl," Chad called out, his voice unnervingly laced with false friendliness, carrying effortlessly across the entire gym. Violet glanced around anxiously, desperately hoping he was addressing someone else, but every single eye in the room had unmistakably turned to her. "Violet," she replied quietly, her voice barely audible above the gym's general ambient noise. "Violet," Chad repeated, deliberately savoring the sound of her name. "That's a pretty name. Tell me, Violet, do you know anything at all about martial arts?" Violet's mouth suddenly went dry. She could feel the stares of everyone in the gym boring intensely into her, and her natural shyness made her instinctively want to disappear entirely into her chair. "A little," she whispered, barely above a breath. Chad's smile widened, a cruel, triumphant smirk. "A little. How utterly interesting." He turned back to his students, his voice rising with exaggerated theatrical excitement. "Class, today we have a very special volunteer who knows a little about martial arts. Violet here is going to help us demonstrate the crucial difference between real, rigorous training and mere amateur dabbling." Several students exchanged uncomfortable, uneasy glances. Even Brandon Scott, despite his inherent competitive nature, seemed visibly uncertain about where this alarming spectacle was heading, though he remained silently observant. Near the front desk, Susan Schmidt was just finishing her conversation with Coach Dan Murphy about registration deadlines, and turned to check on Violet. What she saw made her blood run cold. Her daughter sat frozen in her chair while Chad Cooper addressed the entire class about her, his tone dripping with undisguised condescension. "Don't worry, Violet," Chad called out, his voice now loud enough for everyone in the gym to hear. "This will be educational for everyone. Why don't you come over here and show my students what you know about martial arts?" Susan immediately began walking quickly, purposefully, toward her daughter. But the burgeoning crowd of students and parents had already formed a dense, impassable barrier between them. She could clearly see Violet's terrified expression and felt her protective instincts surge with an overwhelming force. "It's okay, sweetheart," Bella Adams said softly, having instinctively moved closer to Violet's chair. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do." But Chad had already publicly committed to his cruel demonstration. "Come on, Violet. Don't be shy. I promise I'll go easy on you. After all, I'm a professional." The casual, almost chilling cruelty in his tone made several parents shift uncomfortably in their seats. Melissa Grant, an elementary school teacher who had brought her nephew to class, felt her deeply ingrained teacher's instincts activate. She recognized emotional bullying instantly when she saw it, but like many of the other adults present, she felt a profound uncertainty about intervening directly in another instructor's class. Arthur Wallace stopped mopping entirely and leaned heavily against his mop handle, his experienced eyes reading the rapidly escalating situation with crystal clarity. He had witnessed this exact scenario play out countless times in different contexts throughout his long, observant life, and he knew with absolute certainty that it never ended well for the person being targeted. "What do you say, Violet?" Chad pressed on, his voice adopting a mocking, falsely encouraging tone. "Are you going to show my students what real courage looks like, or are you going to hide behind that book forever?" Violet slowly, deliberately closed her book and looked around the crowded room. She could see her mother pushing with increasing urgency through the throng, desperately trying to reach her. She could discern the palpable sympathy in some faces, and the cruel, expectant anticipation in others. Most clearly, she could see Chad Cooper's arrogant, self-satisfied smirk as he waited for her impending humiliation to begin. For a suspended moment, the entire gym held its breath in silent anticipation. Then Violet Schmidt slowly stood up, her small frame seeming impossibly fragile and diminutive next to Chad's imposing, towering presence. But there was something in her posture, something subtly defiant in the way she held her head, that made Arthur Wallace straighten up fully and begin to pay very, very close attention. "Okay," Violet said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for Chad to clearly hear her words. "I'll show you what I know." Chad's grin widened into a truly predatory expression as he gestured grandly toward the center mat. "Excellent. This is going to be very educational indeed." The polished wooden floor felt cold beneath Violet's bare feet as she stepped confidently onto the center mat. Coach Dan Murphy, sensing the unusual commotion, emerged from his office, his military bearing evident in his posture, evident in his every measured step. At 45, Dan had run Warrior's Den with fairness and integrity for 8 years, but Chad's increasingly aggressive teaching methods had become a persistent and difficult problem to manage. "Cooper, what's going on here?" Dan's voice cut through the palpable tension like a sharp blade, his steel-gray eyes immediately assessing the entire situation. Chad turned toward his boss with practiced innocence, his hands spread wide in a gesture of feigned reasonableness. "Just a friendly demonstration, Coach Murphy. Young Violet here volunteered to help show the difference between truly trained fighters and mere weekend warriors." Dan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had received multiple complaints regarding Chad's teaching methods, but the instructor's impressive winning tournament record and undeniable ability to attract a steady stream of paying students made him undeniably valuable to the gym's bottom line. Still, targeting a child crossed a very distinct line, one that made Dan's ingrained military conscience recoil sharply. "I'm not sure this is appropriate," Dan began, but Chad brazenly cut him off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Relax, Coach. It's all in good fun, right, Violet?" Chad's tone dripped with false concern as he looked down at the small girl standing alone in the center of the mat. Violet remained completely silent, her dark eyes studying Chad's face with an unsettling intensity that made several observers distinctly uncomfortable. Susan Schmidt finally managed to break through the surging crowd of spectators, her extensive medical training allowing her to read her daughter's subtle body language with expert precision. "Violet, honey, you don't have to do this," Susan called out, her voice strained and thick with worry. "Let the kid make her own choices," Chad replied smoothly, never once taking his eyes off Violet. "She's old enough to know if she's out of her league." The deliberate, calculated provocation in his words sparked murmurs of discomfort and disapproval throughout the assembled crowd. Mrs. Nancy Kelly clutched her purse tighter, vivid memories resurfacing of the countless times her son Ryan had been subjected to similar psychological pressure and humiliation. Thomas Adams frowned deeply, his construction worker's instincts instantly recognizing a bully when he saw one operating so brazenly. "This isn't right," Bella Adams whispered to Owen Clark, her usual confident demeanor shaken by the ugly, cruel turn the demonstration had taken. Owen nodded grimly, his own painful experiences with Chad's cruelty making him acutely aware of precisely what Violet was about to endure. "He always picks on the quiet ones, makes him feel bigger." Detective Joe Edwards stepped closer to the unfolding action, his finely tuned law enforcement instincts alerting him to potential trouble, the kind that could quickly escalate. In his 20 years on the force, he had seen far too many situations escalate from mere verbal intimidation to dangerous physical confrontation. Something about this particular scenario felt especially volatile and unpredictable. Arthur Wallace positioned himself near the equipment rack, where he could observe everything while remaining largely inconspicuous. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle tightly as poignant memories surfaced of similar injustices he had witnessed throughout his long, observant life. The old janitor's eyes never once left Violet's small figure, meticulously noting subtle details that others entirely missed. "All right," Chad announced, his voice booming. "All right, Violet," Chad announced, his voice echoing off the gym's high ceiling. "Show everyone what you've learned from all those books you read. Let's see some of that little bit of martial arts knowledge you mentioned." Chad deliberately dropped into a loose, exaggerated fighting stance, his movements calculated to highlight the stark contrast between his imposing physical presence and Violet's diminutive stature. Several students gasped audibly at the glaring mismatch, while parents exchanged worried glances, a ripple of unease spreading through the crowd. Violet, however, remained perfectly still, her breathing steady and controlled in a way that seemed unnervingly unusual for a frightened child. She studied Chad's posture with the same intense, focused attention she had given her book moments earlier, as if she were reading something invisible, something only she could perceive. "Come on, don't be shy," Chad taunted, beginning to circle slowly around her, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "Throw a punch, attempt to kick, show us something. Anything." The vast gymnasium fell into an uncomfortable, stifling silence, broken only by the faint hum of the ventilation systems and the distant, rhythmic clang of weight plates in another section of the facility. tension thickened palpably, like a dense fog, as spectators waited for the inevitable, humiliating outcome to begin. Brandon Scott watched from the front row with eager anticipation, absolutely certain that his mentor was about to deliver yet another memorable lesson in superiority and dominance. His mother, Stephanie, absently checked her phone, clearly more concerned with her upcoming dinner reservations than with the psychological torment unfolding before her. "I'm waiting," Chad continued, his patience beginning to fray noticeably as Violet's unwavering stillness disrupted his carefully planned narrative. "Don't tell me you're just going to stand there like a statue." Carly Cooper, Chad's 8-year-old niece, tugged gently on, her uncle's uniform, from the sidelines. "Uncle Chad?" the little girl said innocently, her pure heart instinctively recognizing the profound unfairness of the situation. "Maybe she doesn't want to fight?" Chad brushed off his niece's heartfelt concern with barely concealed irritation, a sharp, dismissive gesture. "Stay out of this, Carly. The adults are teaching important lessons here." Dr. Susan Schmidt felt her protective instincts surge with overwhelming force as she watched her daughter's motionless form, standing resolute in the center of the hostile circle. Every maternal fiber in her body screamed at her to intervene, to sweep Violet away from this cruelly manufactured confrontation. Yet something profound held her back. A strange, unwavering certainty settled within her that her daughter was not nearly as helpless as she appeared to be. "You know what I think?" Chad's voice grew significantly louder, more aggressively cutting as Violet's continued unyielding silence frustrated his increasingly desperate attempts at domination. "I think you've been filling your head with fantasies from those books. I think you actually believe you could handle yourself in a real fight." He took another deliberate step closer to Violet, intentionally invading her personal space in a calculated act of raw intimidation. "Well, here's your chance to prove it. Show everyone that all that reading has taught you something useful." Melissa Grant, the elementary school teacher, felt her professional obligation to protect children warring fiercely with the unspoken social pressure to remain silent. She had seen this exact dynamic play out countless times in school hallways and knew intimately how devastating it could be to a child's delicate self-esteem. "This has gone far enough," Melissa said firmly, stepping forward from the crowd. "She's just a little girl." Chad spun toward the interruption with barely contained fury. "She volunteered, lady. Nobody forced her to accept my challenge. If she wants to back down now, that's her choice." The manipulation in his words was transparent to any adult paying even a modicum of attention. But the complex social dynamics of the situation made intervention incredibly complicated. Parents worried about causing scenes, students feared direct retribution, and staff members navigated very real employment concerns. Arthur Wallace had seen enough. The elderly janitor began moving slowly, almost imperceptibly, toward the very edge of the mat, his movements subtle but imbued with a deep, resolute purpose. Decades of lived experience had taught him to recognize the precise moments when decisive action became absolutely necessary, regardless of social convention or perceived etiquette. "Last chance, Violet," Chad announced, his voice carrying a finality that suggested dire consequences for any continued resistance. "Either show everyone what you've got or admit that you're nothing but a scared little girl who doesn't belong in a real gym." The cruel, vicious words hung in the air like an invisible poison, and several spectators actually recoiled, stepping back as if physically struck by their raw malevolence. Ryan Kelly's face went utterly pale as he recognized the very same tone that had crushed his own fragile confidence countless times before. Then Violet Schmidt spoke for the second time since stepping onto the mat, her voice clear, steady, and remarkably composed, despite her young age. "I'm not scared of you." The simple, unadorned declaration sent ripples of profound shock through the assembled crowd. Chad's eyebrows shot up in genuine, unadulterated surprise, his carefully orchestrated humiliation taking an utterly unexpected, bewildering turn. "Excuse me?" he said, leaning down to bring his face closer to hers, his voice laced with disbelief. Violet looked directly into his eyes, unflinching, without a trace of fear. "I said, I'm not scared of you. You're just a bully who picks on kids because it makes you feel important." The gymnasium erupted in collective gasps and a sudden rush of whispered conversations as spectators processed the 10-year-old's astonishingly fearless and direct assessment. Brandon Scott's mouth fell open in utter disbelief, while his mother, Stephanie, finally looked up from her phone, her attention abruptly yanked away by the sudden profound disturbance. Chad's face flushed a furious deep red with anger and acute embarrassment. No child had ever spoken to him with such raw, unvarnished directness, especially not in front of his meticulously cultivated audience of students and their parents. His carefully maintained image of unassailable authority wavered precariously as murmurs of agreement audibly rippled through significant portions of the crowd. "You want to see a bully?" Chad snarled, dropping all pretense of friendly instruction, his voice laced with venom. "Fine. Let's see how brave you are when facing real consequences for that smart mouth." Coach Dan Murphy immediately stepped forward, his extensive military training instantly recognizing a rapidly spiraling situation that was quickly veering out of control. "Cooper, that's enough. This demonstration is over." But Chad was beyond reason now. His colossal ego, his carefully constructed self-image, had been catastrophically wounded by a mere child's brutally honest assessment of his true character. "No, Coach. This is just getting started. The kid wanted to show off her martial arts knowledge. I'm going to give her that opportunity." He dropped into a more aggressive stance, his movements sharp, precise, and overtly threatening. The playful facade had completely evaporated, replaced by a genuine, palpable menace that made several parents instinctively reach for their children, pulling them closer. Violet, however, remained utterly motionless in the very center of the mat. But something fundamental had irrevocably changed in her posture. The frightened, shy child had completely vanished, replaced by someone who seemed far older, far more self-possessed than her mere 10 years. Her dark eyes tracked Chad's every movement with an almost predatory focus, and her breathing settled into a deep, disciplined rhythm that spoke of years of rigorous, internal training. Arthur Wallace stopped pretending to clean and openly stared at the small girl, a flicker of profound recognition dawning in his experienced eyes. Susan Schmidt felt her heart skip a beat as she observed her daughter's astonishing transformation, vivid memories of her late husband flooding back with startling, almost painful clarity. "Violet?" Susan whispered, but her voice was instantly lost in the suffocating tension that gripped the entire gymnasium. Chad launched forward with a deliberately theatrical punch, designed to stop just short of Violet's face. His sole intention was to make her flinch, to prove his point about courage and training. to humble her. It was a classic intimidation technique he had used successfully dozens of times before, a guaranteed win. What happened next, however, would be talked about in Sunset Hills for years, echoing through the community as a legend. Chad's fist sliced through empty air, precisely where Violet's head had been a mere microsecond earlier. The 10-year-old had moved with liquid precision, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of weight that carried her small body just beyond the reach of his intimidation tactic. But it wasn't the evasion itself that stunned the watching crowd into an absolute breathless silence. It was the effortless, almost ethereal grace with which she had executed it, as if she had anticipated his movement with uncanny accuracy before he had even fully committed to it. "What the hell?" Chad muttered under his breath. His carefully planned, meticulously orchestrated demonstration suddenly and utterly derailed by a child who, by all accounts, should have been cowering in abject terror. Violet's feet returned to their original position on the mat with barely a whisper of sound. Her expression remained perfectly calm, almost serene, as she regarded Chad with the same steady, unwavering focus she might give to a complex page in her book. The transformation was so complete, so utterly profound, that several spectators instinctively rubbed their eyes, wondering if they were truly seeing the same frightened little girl who had reluctantly stepped onto the mat mere minutes earlier. Detective Joe Edwards straightened up sharply from his casual lean against the wall. His trained eye, honed by years of observation, immediately recognized movement patterns that unequivocally spoke of serious, high-level martial arts training. 20 years of law enforcement had exposed him to fighters of every caliber imaginable, and what he had just witnessed displayed a level of skill that simply did not belong in a 10-year-old body. "Did you see that?" Owen Clark whispered to Bella Adams, his voice filled with genuine awe and disbelief. Bella nodded wordlessly, her own athlete's instincts telling her with absolute certainty that Violet's evasion had been no lucky accident or clumsy stumble. The movement had possessed the kind of controlled, precise fluidity that came only from immense dedication, only from years of dedicated, relentless practice. Chad shook his head, attempting to regain his rapidly slipping composure and reassert control over the utterly bewildering situation. "Lucky dodge, kid. But luck runs out eventually." He faked a swift left and then swung his right hand in a wide, powerful arc, specifically designed to force Violet to stumble backward in panic and defenselessness. The technique, he intended, was meant to be purely intimidating rather than genuinely harmful, but his deeply wounded pride had infused genuine, raw force behind the movement. Violet flowed around the strike with the ethereal ease of water around a stone, her small body positioning itself with almost mathematical precision to completely avoid contact while maintaining absolutely perfect balance. This time, several people in the crowd gasped audibly, a collective intake of breath as they witnessed the impossible grace and uncanny precision of her movement. Arthur Wallace dropped his mop entirely, his weathered hands gripping the edge of a nearby equipment rack for support. In 72 years of life, he had encountered only a handful of individuals who could move with such natural, unforced fluidity. The old janitor's eyes narrowed into slits as he meticulously studied Violet's subtle stance, recognizing elements of classical ancient martial arts forms that most modern practitioners had never even heard of, let alone mastered. "This isn't possible," Brandon Scott said loudly, his voice cracking with adolescent confusion and disbelief. "She's just a little kid." Mrs. Stephanie Scott finally gave the demonstration her full, undivided attention, her social media scrolling completely forgotten as she desperately tried to process what her eyes were unequivocally telling her. The woman, who had initially dismissed the entire exercise as utterly beneath her notice, suddenly found herself witnessing something that defied all logical explanation. Chad's face had gone from an angry red to a startling ashen pale as the horrifying reality of his situation began to dawn on him. 3 distinct attempts at intimidation had failed completely, utterly, and worse yet, the child hadn't even appeared to exert a modicum of effort in avoiding his powerful strikes. She moved with the casual, self-assured confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was going to do before he even initiated the movement. "Stop playing games," Chad snarled, his professional demeanor finally cracking under the immense pressure of public, undeniable failure. "Fight back, like you mean it." Violet tilted her head slightly, studying him with an odd, curious interest, as if he were an amusing, if slightly perplexing specimen. "Why would I fight you? You haven't given me any reason to hurt you." The simple, profound statement hit the entire gymnasium like a physical blow. The devastating implications contained within those innocent, quiet words rippled profoundly through the assembled crowd, forcing everyone to confront the true, uncomfortable nature of what they were actually witnessing. This wasn't a mere demonstration of superior skill overwhelming amateur dabbling. This was a highly trained fighter deliberately choosing profound restraint over absolute, undeniable dominance. Coach Dan Murphy felt ice water replace the blood in his veins as the true, terrifying nature of the situation finally became chillingly clear. His military experience had taught him to immediately recognize different levels of threat assessment, and what he was seeing from Violet suggested capabilities, a depth of skill that simply shouldn't exist in someone her tender age. "Dan, who is that child?" Detective Edwards asked quietly, moving to stand directly beside the gym owner, his voice barely a whisper. "Dr. Schmidt's daughter," Dan replied, his own voice barely audible, tinged with a deep, unsettling awe. "She comes in here maybe once a week. Twice a week while her mother handles registration paperwork. Always just sits in that corner reading books." "Well, she's been reading more than fairy tales," Edwards observed grimly, a newfound respect in his tone. "That kid has serious training." Susan Schmidt pushed through the crowd with renewed urgency, her medical background allowing her to read the subtle yet undeniable signs of escalating aggression in Chad's increasingly volatile body language. She had desperately hoped never to see her daughter forced into this kind of brutal situation, but life, as she knew all too well, had a cruel way of bringing the past into the present, whether you wanted it or not. "Violet, sweetheart," Susan called out, her voice cutting clearly across the now utterly silent gymnasium. "Come here, please." But Violet didn't move an inch from her chosen position in the very center of the mat. Her unwavering attention remained fixed solely on Chad, as if she were waiting for him to make a crucial decision that would definitively determine how this tense encounter would ultimately conclude. Chad heard the mother's plea and immediately seized upon it as a desperate opportunity to salvage some semblance of dignity from the increasingly humiliating situation. "Yeah, Violet, run back to Mommy. This is getting too real for you anyway." The taunt was precisely designed to either provoke the child into making a crucial impulsive mistake or to drive her away in tearful public retreat. Either outcome, in Chad's mind, would allow him to claim some form of twisted victory in front of his captive audience. What he didn't expect, what he couldn't have possibly anticipated, was for Violet to simply smile. It wasn't a cruel smile, nor was it a mocking, derisive expression. It was, instead, the gentle, infinitely patient smile of someone who had just heard something quietly amusing from a person who simply didn't understand the underlying joke. It was the smile of a compassionate teacher watching a student struggle with a concept that, in time, would inevitably become crystal clear. "You really don't know, do you?" Violet said softly, her words carrying clearly in the hushed gymnasium, resonating with an unexpected clarity. "Know what?" Chad demanded, his mounting frustration visibly escalating as his perceived authority continued to erode, crumbling before his very eyes. "You don't know who my father was." The profound statement hung in the air like an unspoken challenge, though Violet's tone remained remarkably conversational and mild, devoid of any aggression. Several adults in the crowd exchanged quick, knowing glances, sensing with a shared intuition that they were about to learn something profoundly significant. Arthur Wallace suddenly sucked in a sharp breath, a gasp of dawning realization. Pieces of a complex puzzle suddenly clicked into place in his sharp, experienced mind. The old janitor's eyes widened perceptibly as vivid memories of old newspaper articles and grainy television coverage from years past began urgently surfacing in his consciousness. He stepped closer to the escalating action, his cleaning duties entirely forgotten. "Your father?" Chad scoffed, though his voice notably lacked its earlier arrogant confidence, a subtle tremor betraying his unease. "What does your daddy have to do with anything? Is he going to come save you?" Violet's gentle smile faded, replaced by an expression of profound, almost heart-wrenching sadness that seemed far too mature, too heavy for her young face. "He can't save anyone anymore. He died when I was 6. The stark revelation struck the assembled crowd like a physical blow, transforming Chad's cruel mockery into something undeniably ugly and deeply callous. Several parents actually stepped back, physically recoiling as if trying to distance themselves from the casual cruelty they had just witnessed. "But before he died," Violet continued, her voice growing steadily stronger, imbued with a quiet, unwavering conviction, "he taught me everything he knew about martial arts. Everything his father taught him, and everything his grandfather learned in the old country." Susan Schmidt felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as her daughter spoke openly about the profound loss that had irrevocably shaped both their lives. She had tried so incredibly hard to give Violet a normal childhood, to let her choose her own path without the crushing weight of legacy and expectation. But some inheritances, she now understood, simply couldn't be escaped. "He was Michael Schmidt," Violet said quietly, her words carrying clearly, distinctly to every corner of the vast gymnasium. "Maybe you've heard of him?" The name hit Arthur Wallace like a bolt of lightning, instantly confirming suspicions that had been steadily building in his mind. Several other adults in the crowd began murmuring amongst themselves as recognition dawned upon their faces, though Chad's face remained blank, utterly devoid of any understanding. "Never heard of him," Chad said dismissively, though his voice notably carried less conviction than before. a subtle tremor betraying his growing unease. Detective Edwards, however, pulled out his smartphone and began typing rapidly, his law enforcement background making him automatically fact-check any claims that seemed extraordinary or unbelievable. What he found on the screen made him whistle low under his breath, a sound of genuine astonishment. "Holy shit," Edwards muttered, then quickly caught himself in the presence of children. "I mean, holy cow." "What is it?" Dan Murphy asked, leaning over to see the detective's phone screen, his own curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in atmosphere. Edwards turned the device so Dan could read the Wikipedia article that had appeared after a simple search. The gym owner's face went stark white as he rapidly absorbed the astonishing information displayed there. "Michael Lightning Schmidt," Edwards read aloud, his voice now carrying clearly across the suddenly silent gymnasium. "Three-time Olympic medalist in Taekwondo, world champion in mixed martial arts for 6 consecutive years. Considered one of the most naturally gifted fighters of his generation, before his tragic death in a car accident 4 years ago." The words fell into the hushed space like heavy stones dropped into distilled water, creating ever-widening ripples of shock and profound understanding that spread throughout the assembled crowd. Chad's mouth fell open in disbelief, his carefully constructed arrogance finally beginning to crumble as the full implications of what he had been doing began to sink in with horrifying clarity. "That little girl," Edwards continued, his voice filled with something approaching genuine awe, "is the daughter of one of the most accomplished martial artists in modern history." Violet stood perfectly still in the very center of the mat, her small frame suddenly seeming to carry the immense weight of an incredible, almost legendary legacy. The frightened, shy child who had reluctantly accepted Chad's cruel challenge had vanished completely, utterly replaced by someone who clearly and profoundly understood exactly what she was capable of. "Now, do you want to keep playing this game?" Violet asked Chad, her voice still gentle, still calm, but now carrying an undeniable undertone that made every single adult in the room suddenly, acutely aware that they were in the presence of something truly extraordinary, something far beyond their comprehension. Chad Cooper, for the very first time in his entire adult life, found himself completely and utterly speechless. Silence stretched across the gymnasium like a taut, strained wire, humming with unspoken tension, ready to snap at any given moment. Chad's face cycled rapidly through a turbulent maelstrom of emotions, too quickly to even track or comprehend. Disbelief, acute embarrassment, simmering anger, and something that might undeniably have been stark fear flickering within his eyes. The once arrogant instructor, who had so effortlessly dominated this space for 3 long years, suddenly looked undeniably small, almost insignificant despite his imposing physical presence. "You're lying," Chad finally managed to stammer, his voice strained with desperation, a desperate plea for something, anything, to salvage his crumbling reality. "There's no way that little girl is related to a world champion fighter." Detective Edwards, without a word, held up his smartphone screen, displaying a family photograph he had found instantly in his rapid search. The image clearly showed a tall, powerfully built man with kind, gentle eyes, kneeling beside a much younger Violet, both of them wearing matching pristine white uniforms adorned with colored belts. The striking resemblance between father and daughter was unmistakable, undeniable. Michael Schmidt with his daughter Violet at a youth tournament in Oregon, 2 years before his death. Edwards read aloud from the caption, his voice calm and clear. The caption also mentions that he had begun training her personally after she showed exceptional natural ability. Mrs. Nancy Kelly immediately covered her mouth with her hands, a sudden profound understanding washing over her. She now comprehended why her own son, Ryan, had always spoken with such admiration of the quiet girl who constantly read books in the corner. Children, she realized, often recognized fundamental truths that adults, blinded by their own preconceptions, frequently missed. And Ryan had somehow intuitively sensed Violet's unique, extraordinary qualities, even when the grown-ups remained utterly oblivious. "This changes everything," Thomas Adams said, more to himself than to anyone else in particular, his construction workers' ingrained respect for genuine skill and profound dedication, forcing him to reassess everything he thought he knew about the unassuming child. Violet remained utterly motionless in the very center of the mat, but the quality of her stillness had subtly evolved. It was no longer nervous tension, but rather a perfect, poised readiness. She now resembled a tightly coiled spring, perfectly calibrated, waiting for the precise, opportune moment to unleash its stored energy. Her dark eyes tracked Chad's every minute movement, with the unwavering patience of someone who could wait forever for the exactly right opportunity to present itself. "I don't care who her father was," Chad declared, though his voice now clearly lacked any real conviction, a hollow boast. "Dead men don't teach martial arts. Whatever she might have learned as a little kid, it's nothing compared to real training." The sheer cruelty of his words, particularly regarding Violet's deceased father, sparked angry murmurs throughout the rapidly shifting crowd. Several parents exchanged disgusted, furious looks, their tolerance for Chad's increasingly reprehensible behavior finally reaching its absolute breaking point. Melissa Grant, the elementary school teacher, stepped forward decisively from the group of observers, her deeply ingrained teacher's instincts overriding any lingering social convention or fear. "Mr. Cooper, I think you should apologize to that child and end this demonstration immediately." Chad spun toward her, venomous fury burning in his eyes. "Stay out of this, lady. This is between me and the kid." "No," Melissa replied firmly, her extensive classroom experience with confronting bullies giving her unwavering confidence. "This is between an adult man and a 10-year-old girl. There's nothing fair or educational about what you're doing." Support for Melissa's resolute position rippled audibly through the crowd as more and more parents found their voices, their collective indignation rising. The spell of authority that had kept them silent began to weaken noticeably as Chad's true ugly character became impossible to ignore or justify. "She volunteered," Chad insisted, a desperate edge to his voice. Insisted, but his argument sounded hollow even to his own ears. "She was coerced," Melissa shot back, her voice unwavering. "Any adult can see that." Coach Dan Murphy felt the immense weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders as he watched his gym's carefully built reputation visibly crumble in real time. Every instinct screamed at him to end the demonstration immediately, to shut it down, but a potent professional curiosity warred fiercely with his protective duty. If Violet truly possessed her father's legendary abilities, what they were currently witnessing might be utterly unprecedented, a historical moment in martial arts. "Maybe we should let the child decide," Dan said carefully, his gaze directly addressing Violet. "Violet, do you want to continue this demonstration?" Or would you prefer to stop right now? All eyes in the gymnasium turned to the small girl standing alone, yet powerfully, in the center of the mat. She looked slowly around the circle of faces, meticulously reading their expressions and emotions with a startling accuracy for someone her tender age. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the quiet, unwavering authority of someone who had already made peace with profoundly difficult decisions. "I'll finish what he started," Violet said simply, her tone clear and resolute. "But only because he needs to learn something important." The words sent immediate chills through the assembled crowd. There was something in Violet's calm, steady tone that strongly suggested Chad was about to receive an unexpected education, one he hadn't anticipated and certainly wouldn't enjoy. Arthur Wallace nodded slowly from his position near the equipment racks, a profound recognition finally dawning in his experienced eyes. He had served in 3 wars and worked alongside elite fighters throughout his long life, and he was now beginning to fully understand that they were witnessing something truly extraordinary, a rare phenomenon. Chad's face flushed a deep, furious red with renewed anger as his rapidly diminishing authority continued to erode before his very eyes. Fine. Let's see what the daughter of a dead champion can actually do. The callous, utterly heartless reference to Michael Schmidt's tragic death pushed several spectators past their breaking point, their tolerance for Chad's cruelty finally exhausted. Ryan Kelly's young voice suddenly cut through the thick tension with startling, unexpected clarity. "My dad died, too," the 11-year-old said loudly, his usual shyness completely overwhelmed by a wave of righteous indignation. "You don't get to make fun of people for that." His mother, Nancy, felt an overwhelming swell of pride in her chest as her normally quiet son found the astonishing courage to speak truth to such brazen power. Other children, emboldened by Ryan's courage, began voicing their own support, creating a growing chorus of young voices that made Chad's isolation complete, undeniable. "Shut up, Kelly!" Chad snapped, his professional composure finally collapsing entirely, replaced by raw, uncontrolled fury. "Nobody asked for your opinion." "Leave him alone," Violet said, her voice cutting through the noise like a precisely sharpened blade. The simple, quiet command carried such undeniable authority that Chad actually took an instinctive step backward without any conscious thought, a visible reaction of startled submission. Carly Cooper tugged on her uncle's uniform again, her 8-year-old heart profoundly troubled by the escalating ugliness she was witnessing. "Uncle Chad, why are you being so mean? Daddy says we should be nice to people." Chad brushed off his niece's hand with barely concealed irritation, a flash of annoyance in his eyes. "Your daddy doesn't understand how the real world works, Carly. Sometimes people need to learn hard lessons." The casual dismissal of his own family member's heartfelt concern revealed disturbing depths of Chad's selfishness, arrogance that shocked even Chad's most ardent supporters. Brandon Scott shifted uncomfortably, a profound wave of doubt beginning to erode his unwavering loyalty to an instructor who now seemed utterly incapable of basic human decency. Susan Schmidt watched the exchange with growing alarm, instantly recognizing the dangerous signs of a man whose ego had been so catastrophically damaged that rational thought had become entirely impossible. She had witnessed similar volatile behavior in hospital settings when certain arrogant doctors were challenged, and she knew precisely how dangerous wounded pride could truly become. "Violet, please come here," Susan called out again, her maternal instincts screaming. Urgent warnings about the volatile, rapidly escalating situation. But Violet shook her head gently, her dark eyes never once leaving Chad's face. "It's okay, Mom. This won't take long." The quiet, unsettling confidence in her daughter's voice sent shivers down Susan's spine. She recognized something profound in Violet's demeanor that reminded her powerfully of Michael and his most fiercely competitive days. The same calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of, without needing to boast or prove it. Chad began circling Violet like a predator, meticulously sizing up his prey. His movements were now aggressive, sharp, and overtly threatening. "All right, little girl. No more games. Let's see if Daddy's ghost taught you anything useful." He dropped into a combat stance that displayed genuine, formidable skill. His earlier theatrical poses were completely gone, replaced by the precise positioning of someone truly prepared for actual, physical conflict. The sudden, drastic change in his demeanor sent immediate alarm bells ringing through the minds of every adult present. "Chad, that's enough," Coach Murphy commanded, his military authority finally asserting itself with an undeniable force. "Step away from the child." "No," Chad replied, his voice defiant, never looking away from Violet. "She wanted to play with the big kids. Now she gets to see what that really means." Detective Edwards began moving purposefully toward the mat, his law enforcement training immediately recognizing a situation that was about to escalate dangerously beyond anyone's control, spiraling into violence. But before he could effectively intervene, Violet spoke again. "Mr. Cooper," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly hushed gymnasium. "Before we finish this, I want you to know something." Chad paused in his circling, momentarily caught off guard by her surprisingly conversational tone, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What?" Violet's expression grew thoughtful, almost reflective, as if she were carefully considering how best to explain something incredibly complex to someone who might truly struggle to understand. "My father taught me that martial arts isn't about proving you're stronger than other people. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves." She gestured subtly toward the crowd of children watching the confrontation with wide, mesmerized eyes. "All these kids look up to you. They trust you to teach them and keep them safe. But instead, you use your skills to hurt and humiliate them." The simple, profound observation landed like a physical blow, forcing Chad to confront the harsh, undeniable reality of his behavior in stark terms he couldn't possibly dismiss or rationalize away. Several students nodded in solemn agreement with Violet's astute assessment, their young faces reflecting years of accumulated hurt and quiet frustration. "That's why you need to learn this lesson," Violet continued, her voice remaining calm, gentle, despite the immense weight of her words. "Not because I want to hurt you, but because these children deserve better." Chad's face twisted with pure, unadulterated rage as the 10-year-old's undeniable moral authority made his own profound failings utterly impossible to ignore or rationalize away. "Enough talking!" he snarled, lunging forward with genuine malicious intent to overwhelm her through sheer brute force and his clearly superior size. What happened next would be replayed in slow motion, an indelible mental film in the minds of everyone present for years to come. Violet moved like water becoming wind, a seamless, fluid transition. Her small body flowed around Chad's aggressive attack with such effortless liquid grace that it seemed to utterly defy the very laws of physics. In one continuous, seamless motion, she expertly redirected his momentum, brilliantly used his own immense force against him, and sent the much larger man stumbling wildly past her, propelled irresistibly forward to crash with a sickening thud into the equipment rack directly behind her. The jarring sound of Chad's body hitting the metal rack echoed thunderously through the gymnasium like a gunshot, followed immediately by the clatter of falling weights and scattered exercise equipment. Then, an absolute silence descended, so profound, so complete that the low hum of the ventilation system suddenly seemed deafeningly loud. Chad lay sprawled awkwardly among the scattered equipment, his eyes wide with profound shock, and his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. He wasn't seriously injured, not physically, but his immense pride had been obliterated so completely, so utterly, that he seemed genuinely unable to comprehend what had just transpired, what had just happened to him. Violet stood exactly where she had been before Chad's attack, her feet still in the same position, her breathing utterly unchanged, perfectly calm. She looked down at the fallen instructor with something that might truly have been pity in her dark eyes. "I told you this wouldn't take long," she said quietly, her voice a soft murmur. The metallic groaning of the equipment rack filled the void left by the collective, stunned shock as Chad struggled desperately to extract himself from the tangled mess of weights and exercise gear. His pristine white uniform now bore distinct scuff marks and unsightly tears, transforming his previously immaculate, arrogant appearance into something resembling a defeated prize fighter after a brutal, one-sided match. Blood trickled faintly from a small, insignificant cut on his forehead where he had struck a barbell, and his usual arrogant, dominant posture had crumpled entirely into something approaching genuine humility. Arthur Wallace was the very first to break the stunned silence, a low, drawn-out whistle escaping his weathered lips. "In 72 years, I've never seen anything quite like that," he muttered, shaking his head slowly in sheer amazement. Detective Edwards found his voice next, though it came out as barely more than a strained whisper. "She didn't even break a sweat." Indeed, Violet appeared completely unaffected by the encounter. Her breathing remained perfectly steady, her posture relaxed and poised, and her expression carried the same patient kindness she might show to a confused younger child. She watched Chad's struggles with what appeared to be genuine concern for his well-being rather than any hint of satisfaction at his overwhelming defeat. "Are you hurt?" Violet asked, taking a small, gentle step toward the fallen instructor. Chad flinched violently away from her approach, recoiling as if she were approaching him with a dangerous weapon rather than simply offering assistance. The raw, unmistakable fear in his eyes was palpable, transforming the dynamic between them so completely, so profoundly, that several onlookers gasped anew. Spectators experienced profound cognitive dissonance, desperately trying to reconcile the impossible reality of what they were witnessing with their preconceived notions. "Stay away from me!" Chad gasped, his voice cracking with a raw, uncontrolled cocktail of emotions. "Just stay away!" Brandon Scott stood frozen near the front of the crowd, his entire worldview crumbling around him as he watched his once indomitable mentor reduced to cowering primal fear by a mere 10-year-old girl. Everything he had ever believed about strength, dominance, and superiority now lay in shattered ruins around the equipment rack where Chad continued to struggle, tangled and defeated. "I don't understand," Brandon said aloud, his adolescent voice carrying clearly across the silent gymnasium, imbued with genuine confusion. "How did she do that?" Coach Dan Murphy approached the very edge of the mat with cautious respect, his military bearing evident in every measured step as he addressed Violet directly. "Miss Schmidt, would you mind explaining what just happened here?" Violet turned toward the gym owner with the same serious, thoughtful expression she had worn while reading her book moments earlier. "He tried to hurt me," she explained simply, her voice calm and even. "So I moved him somewhere else. My father taught me that the best way to end a fight is to make sure nobody gets seriously injured." The simple, almost childlike explanation only deepened the profound mystery for most observers. What Violet had accomplished appeared to violate fundamental principles of physics, yet she described it as casually as discussing the weather. Mrs. Nancy Kelly found herself stepping forward from the crowd, her protective instincts extending beyond her own son to encompass the remarkable child who had just bravely defended the dignity of every single student in the gymnasium. "Violet, honey, where did you learn to do that?" "My basement," Violet replied matter-of-factly, her tone devoid of any pretense or drama. "Mom set up mats and equipment after Dad died. She said I needed to keep practicing what he taught me." Susan Schmidt felt every single eye in the gymnasium turn sharply toward her, and in that moment she knew with absolute certainty that the time for secrecy had irrevocably ended. Her extensive medical career had taught her to face difficult truths directly, unflinchingly, and the situation had now moved far beyond her ability to maintain their carefully constructed normal life. "Michael started training her when she was 4, Susan said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed space, tinged with a deep, resonant emotion. "He said she had natural ability unlike anything he had ever seen." She paused, a visible struggle within her. "After the accident, I didn't know what else to do with all the equipment and knowledge he had left behind." "Huh?" Melissa Grant studied Susan's face with the sharp analytical skills that made her such an effective teacher. "You've been training her yourself all this time." Susan nodded reluctantly, a slight flush rising to her cheeks. "I was a competitive athlete before medical school. Michael taught me everything he knew during our marriage. When he died, Violet was all I had left of him." The revelation added new, complex layers of understanding to what the crowd had just witnessed. This wasn't just a child with inherited talent. This was the astonishing product of intensive, consistent training by 2 expert practitioners over the course of 6 long, dedicated years. Owen Clark tentatively raised his hand, as if he were in a classroom rather than a bustling gymnasium. "Mrs. Schmidt, is Violet better than her father was?" The audacious question hung in the air. The air like a direct challenge to everything the observers thought they understood about martial arts, about age, and about human potential itself. Susan looked at her daughter with a complex mixture of profound pride and something that might have been deep concern. "Michael always said that Violet had abilities he could never match," Susan admitted, her voice soft but clear. "Her understanding of movement and balance seems almost instinctual, but she's still just a child, and I've tried to teach her that power without wisdom is inherently dangerous." Chad finally managed to extricate himself from the tangled equipment rack, though he remained seated on the floor, making no immediate attempt to stand. His face bore an expression of utter bewilderment, as if he were trying desperately to solve a complex puzzle that had far too many missing pieces. "This doesn't make sense," Chad said, more to himself than to anyone else, his voice a disoriented murmur. "She's 10 years old. 10-year-olds don't move like that." Violet, with a calm, deliberate grace, walked over to where Chad sat and extended her small hand toward him in an offer of gentle assistance. The gesture was so remarkably natural, so unexpectedly kind, that it brought tears to the eyes of several observers. "Age doesn't matter as much as people think," Violet said gently, her voice soothing. "My father always told me that martial arts is about understanding, not just strength. You're strong, but you don't understand what strength is really for." Chad stared at the offered hand for a long, silent moment before reluctantly, almost hesitantly, accepting it. To everyone's utter amazement, Violet's seemingly delicate frame had no difficulty whatsoever helping the much larger man to his feet, though she made the assistance appear entirely effortless rather than dramatic or boastful. "I've been doing this wrong," Chad said suddenly, the words emerging as if they surprised even himself, a dawning realization. "Everything I thought I knew about teaching, about martial arts, about everything." Thomas Adams felt his profound respect for the small girl deepen exponentially as he watched her treat her defeated opponent with such remarkable dignity and genuine compassion. "That's what real strength looks like," he murmured to his daughter Bella, a lesson etched into his mind. Bella nodded enthusiastically, her own athletic background helping her appreciate the extraordinary, almost supernatural skill she had just witnessed. "She made it look so easy," Bella whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Like she was dancing instead of fighting." Detective Edwards approached the small group surrounding Chad and Violet, his years of law enforcement experience making him intensely curious about the technical aspects of what had just occurred. "Violet, could you explain how you did that for those of us who don't understand martial arts?" Violet considered the question with the same serious, thoughtful attention she gave to her schoolwork. "He was angry and off balance already," she explained calmly. "When someone attacks you with strong emotions, they're usually moving too fast and not thinking clearly. I just had to redirect his energy instead of fighting against it." The explanation sounded deceptively simple, but Edwards immediately recognized that the execution must have required perfect timing, precise positioning, and an almost supernatural ability to read an opponent's intentions before they even fully formed. What Violet casually described as basic technique truly represented a level of mastery that most martial artists never achieved in a lifetime of dedication. "Could you teach other people to do that?" Ryan Kelly asked from the crowd, his young voice filled with a powerful mixture of hope and unbridled admiration. Violet looked towards her mother, a silent question in her eyes, seeking permission for something that would clearly represent a major, fundamental life change for both of them. Susan's expression cycled through concern, profound pride, and a quiet resignation, before finally settling on something that might best be described as acceptance. "I don't know if I'm ready to be a teacher," Violet said honestly, her voice thoughtful. "But maybe I could help people understand what my father taught me about protecting others instead of hurting them." The suggestion sparked excited murmurs throughout the assembled crowd. Parents who had watched their children suffer under Chad's harsh, demeaning methods suddenly saw the inspiring possibility of something infinitely better, something that would build confidence and self-esteem rather than systematically tearing it down. Coach Dan Murphy cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention to himself as he prepared to address the unprecedented situation that had just dramatically unfolded in his gymnasium. I think we all need to take some time to process what we've seen here today. Chad, I believe you and I need to have a private conversation about your future with this facility. Chad nodded numbly, his usual defiance completely absent, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The man who had terrorized students and parents for 3 years had been utterly replaced by someone who seemed genuinely confused about his own identity and purpose. "Before we go," Violet said, her voice gentle but firm, addressing the crowd of children who had watched the entire confrontation with wide, mesmerized eyes. "I want you all to remember something important." The young faces turned towards her with expressions of rapt attention, as if they were receiving profound wisdom from someone far older and infinitely wiser than her apparent age suggested. "Nobody has the right to make you feel small or worthless," Violet continued, her voice carrying clearly, resonating with a quiet power to every corner of the gymnasium. "If someone tries to bully you, it's because they don't understand their own strength. Real strength is about helping people, not hurting them." The simple yet profound message resonated deeply through the crowd of children and adults alike, providing an immediate moral framework for understanding the extraordinary events they had just witnessed. Several parents found themselves quietly wiping away tears as they realized how profoundly the afternoon had changed their fundamental understanding of courage, of justice, and of the true, deeper meaning of martial arts. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, whispered conversations and excited, hopeful planning filling the air, one thing became abundantly clear to everyone present. The quiet little girl who read books in the corner had just transformed their entire community's understanding of what was truly possible when knowledge, unparalleled skill, and deep compassion came together in unwavering defense of what was inherently right. 3 days after the seismic confrontation that had shaken Warriors Den Fitness Center to its very foundation, the gymnasium bore little resemblance to the tense, hostile battleground where Chad Cooper's tyrannical reign of intimidation had come to its dramatic, ignominious end. Word of Violet Schmidt's extraordinary demonstration had spread through Sunset Hills like wildfire, drawing curious visitors and concerned parents who wanted desperately to understand what had truly happened within those walls. Coach Dan Murphy sat in his cramped office, reviewing the resignation paperwork that Chad had submitted without argument the morning after his humbling, public defeat. The document lay unsigned on Dan's desk while he wrestled with monumental decisions that would irrevocably reshape his business and potentially transform the lives of dozens of students who had suffered silently under Chad's harsh, damaging methods. A gentle knock on his office door interrupted Dan's brooding contemplation. "Come in," he called, straightening the scattered papers across his desk. Susan Schmidt entered the office with the measured, quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under immense pressure. Her medical scrubs had been replaced by casual civilian clothes, but her bearing still carried the distinct authority of someone who routinely saved lives in high-stress situations. "Dr. Schmidt," Dan said, rising from his chair with military precision. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Susan settled into the worn leather chair across from Dan's desk. her dark eyes assessing the gym owner with the same analytical intensity her daughter had displayed during the confrontation with Chad. "You said you wanted to discuss Violet's future involvement with the gymnasium." Dan nodded, choosing his words carefully, deliberately. "What happened here 3 days ago has forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about how this facility has been operating. Chad's methods created an environment that was toxic for many of our students, particularly those who didn't fit his narrow, rigid definition of acceptable. I've heard similar concerns from other parents," Susan replied diplomatically, her voice calm. "Violet mentioned that some of the children seemed afraid during classes." "More than afraid," Dan admitted, his military honesty compelling him toward a brutal, honest self-assessment. "Terrified, humiliated, and in some cases genuinely traumatized. I've received 17 phone calls since Monday from parents sharing stories about their children's experiences that I frankly didn't want to hear but needed to." Susan's expression softened slightly as she recognized the immense weight of responsibility visibly bearing down on the older man's shoulders. "Children often hide their pain to protect the adults they love. It takes extraordinary circumstances for that truth to truly surface." Dan leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 45 years, the weariness evident in his posture. "Your daughter created those extraordinary circumstances. The question now is what we do with the profound opportunity she's given us." Before Susan could fully respond, another knock interrupted their conversation. Dan called for entry, and Detective Joe Edwards stepped into the office, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. "Sorry to interrupt," Edwards said, a slight apology in his voice, "but I wanted to follow up on our conversation from yesterday." Detective Edwards has been helping me understand the legal implications of what occurred here. Dan explained to Susan, his voice steady. Explained to Susan, particularly regarding Chad's behavior toward the children. Edwards pulled out a small notebook, his expression serious but devoid of accusation. "Dr. Schmidt, I've spoken with several parents whose children were present during the incident. The unanimous consensus is that your daughter acted in self-defense against what could reasonably be characterized as assault." Susan felt her protective instincts surge, though she kept her voice level and steady. "Are you suggesting that charges should be filed against Chad?" "Possibly," Edwards replied, his gaze unwavering. "Against Violet? Absolutely not. What she did was textbook defensive action. The problem is that Chad seems to have been engaging in systematic psychological abuse of minors for an extended period." Dan's face paled, the daunting legal ramifications of years of his own unwitting, or perhaps willful, ignorance beginning to crystallize with terrifying clarity. How serious could this become? "That depends on whether parents decide to pursue formal complaints," Edwards said honestly. "But I didn't come here to discuss legal problems. I came here because my daughter attends classes at this gymnasium, and I want to know what changes you're planning to implement." The revelation that Edwards himself had personal stakes in the gymnasium's future immediately added a new layer of urgency and weight to the conversation. Susan studied both men's faces, recognizing the immense weight of community expectations settling firmly on their shoulders. "What exactly are you proposing?" Susan asked Dan directly, her gaze firm. Dan took a deep breath, committing himself fully to a course of action that had been steadily forming in his mind ever since he witnessed Violet's astonishing demonstration. "I want to offer your daughter the position of youth instructor, with you serving as program coordinator and supervisor." The ambitious proposal hung in the air between them like a newly constructed bridge, spanning a wide chasm of uncertainty and radical change. Susan's mind raced, rapidly calculating the complex implications, potential complications, and exciting possibilities that such an unprecedented arrangement would inevitably create. "She's 10 years old?" Susan said quietly, stating the obvious yet profound truth. "She's also the most skilled martial artist I've ever seen."